Hi guys, okay, in this video I'm going to focus on vagabonds, beggars, begging, sturdy beggars, all that kind of thing. So before we get started, I'm just going to quickly do a timeline with key dates that you can use in your answer on vagabonds. The first date I would like you to try and get stuck in your head is under Henry VII in 1494, the Vagabonds Act. And this basically said that beggars or vagabonds could be put in the stocks for 3 days and nights and then sent back to where they came from. So quite a lenient corporal punishment way of dealing with them. The next date I would like you to try and remember and have stuck in your head is 1531. And this is an act in which beggars and vagabonds were deemed to be either deserving or undeserving. And undeserving were things like people like sturdy beggars who were lazy and would resort to crime. And what this act basically did is say that if they were deserving, they could beg. However, the undeserving would be whipped and then returned home to where they came from. Okay, and then finally, 1547. 1547 Vagrancy Act said that beggars were forced to work. They could be whipped and branded, and in fact they could be enslaved. And if they kept breaking the law and they kept begging and being vagabonds, they could actually be executed. Okay, so I'd like you to try and remember 1494 Vagabond Act, the 1531 Act where they could be whipped and returned home, and then the 1547 Act where they could be enslaved or even executed. The only other date that's really important is that by 1601 the idea of a deserving poor has emerged, and that actually poor people can't help being poor, and there's something called the Poor Act which comes through in Elizabeth's government, but that's towards the end of looking at vagabonds, but it's just worth noting. So why were vagabonds punished so harshly? Well, it's really quite simple. Beggars were seen as a threat to society. They were hated and they were feared, and people really didn't like them. They resented the fact that they had to pay for people to lay about and do nothing, an attitude which is still about today. And actually, government and landowners saw them as a threat, and they were willing to move about the country, travel from place to place, in their minds commit crime, or beg, or just generally be a nuisance. And they're kind of rejecting the social order at the time, in the mind of the government and landowners. In reality, they were probably just poor and just desperate for something to eat. Factors, I should have done factors first, but factors that were in play here are government, and the government making laws against vagabonds. So that's a really important one. People's attitudes, especially the attitude of people that they don't want to support beggars and vagabonds, and that they're a problem and they're a threat and they're a nuisance. Poverty is a really, really big one, because without poverty you wouldn't have vagabonds and beggars. It's still something that's around today. Towns and travel, so towns are increasing, populations are getting bigger, which means that you've got more unemployed people who are willing to travel on better roads from town to town in the hope of begging or getting some food or somewhere to stay. And then finally, religion. With the decline of Catholicism and the disappearance of monasteries, poor people can no longer go and get some food or Christian support from the Catholic Church. Okay, so why did vagabonds and beggars emerge in the period 1500 to 1700? Well, the first thing to make a note of is Henry II. Upon becoming the new King of England, the first Tudor monarch, he bans private armies, and all the soldiers in the armies of the barons are sacked. Okay, the only army that's allowed is Henry VII's army. So you have thousands and thousands of unemployed soldiers wandering around, homeless, without food, without a job, generally becoming a nuisance. A lot of these soldiers would go on to become sturdy beggars, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Henry VIII dissolved monasteries, the dissolution of the monasteries, the break from Rome. Monasteries under the Catholic Church had been a really, really good place for people to get charity from. So if you were poor, say it's 1450, you're poor, you've got no food, you've got nowhere to stay, you could go to a monastery and appeal to the good Christian sense of the monks, and they might give you something to eat and somewhere to sleep. With the monasteries disappearing with the break with Rome, people can no longer go and seek help from the church or from monks and monasteries, so they now have to travel from town to town. Thirdly, you have a rising population, which is really important because the more people there are, the less jobs there are, the more unemployed, and the more beggars you have wandering around towns and villages and the countryside, sometimes getting up to no good. And travel improves, people are more willing to travel, they're more willing to leave their town or village and go somewhere else. Roads improve, which make it easier for people to get around. And finally, you have bad harvests. And the 1500s, especially the 1590s, see some really, really terrible harvests. People are paid poor wages, they can't afford enough food. So poverty is a huge factor in the reason why vagabonds become an issue. Okay, so did people actually live in terror of the tramp? Well, no and yes. Yes, if you are rich and you are a landowner, and the harsh laws of whipping and even executing vagabonds tell us that landowners and the government did see them as a threat and did blame them for a lot of the crime that was happening. Now, some vagabonds, especially sturdy beggars, were criminals and did do criminal acts, but the majority of them were just poor people who were unemployed and wanted some food. Part of the reason for the growth in attitudes or the change in people's attitudes towards beggars is partly their own selfishness, but also the increase in printing and pamphleteers who would print booklets and pamphlets about how you have to be careful of sturdy beggars, how they are dangerous and you shouldn't go travelling on your own. And this all helped to create the myth that there was this threat of the tramp, of the vagabond. Okay, so in general, no, they were just poor people who wanted something to eat and somewhere to live. Okay, so finally that takes us to sturdy beggars. Now, sturdy beggars were on the whole either ex-soldiers or criminals who decided that they would find an alternative to work. The most common ones, which you should remember from lesson, are the bristler, the bare-top trickster, Tom Bedlam, and the counterfeit crank. I'm not going to go through them in this video, but they're really good examples of sturdy beggars. And if the authorities are to be worried of one group in society, it probably was sturdy beggars. But generally speaking, no. Sturdy beggars and vagabonds were not too much of a threat.